Some people spend a lifetime wondering why someone they love never came home. Rebecca Foster never stopped wondering. After her grandfather vanished without a trace, she lost the only family she had left. With nowhere else to go, she and her loyal dog, Buddy, moved into the abandoned farm her grandfather had left behind. She thought she was burying the past. Instead, she was walking straight into it. On her very first night, someone knocked. 3 slow knocks. When Rebecca opened the door, there was no one there. But that was only the beginning, because hidden inside that old farmhouse was a secret her grandfather had spent years protecting. A secret that would change everything Rebecca believed about the man who raised her. Every morning, before she ate breakfast, Rebecca Foster placed 2 bowls on the small folding table inside the old pickup truck she had been living in. One bowl was hers. The other belonged to a man everyone believed would never come home. Buddy, the aging shepherd mix, always walked to that second bowl first. He would sniff it, then stare quietly through the windshield toward the empty country road. Only after Rebecca whispered, "Maybe tomorrow, old boy," would he finally begin to eat. People say dogs don't understand grief. Buddy proved them wrong every single day. Rebecca was only 23, but life had already taken almost everyone she loved. Her parents died in a car accident when she was 8, leaving her with only one family member, her grandfather, Henry Foster. Henry wasn't a perfect man. He had once been the sheriff of Cedar Hollow, respected by everyone in town. But after losing his son and daughter-in-law, grief nearly destroyed him. He lost his badge, his friends, and, for a while, even himself. Then, one evening, he looked at the little girl sleeping on his couch and made a choice. He poured every bottle of whiskey he owned down the kitchen sink. From that day on, he never touched another drink. Instead, he worked wherever someone needed him, repairing fences, fixing tractors, replacing roofs, anything that could keep food on the table. Whenever Rebecca apologized for being a burden, Henry would smile and say, "Life doesn't decide who we become, Becca, we do." Those words stayed with her long after she was old enough to understand what they had cost him. Buddy joined their family a few years later after Henry rescued him from an abandoned gas station. The frightened dog refused to enter the house that first night, so Henry stayed outside with him until sunrise. From then on, Buddy never left his side. The 3 of them never had much money, but they had enough. Enough laughter. Enough homemade dinners. Enough quiet evenings watching the sun disappear beyond the fields. Looking back, Rebecca would one day realize those ordinary moments had been the richest days of her life. Then, 6 months ago, Henry vanished. His truck was found on a lonely county road. His wallet was still inside. His keys were still in the ignition. There was no sign of a struggle. No explanation. Only Buddy, waiting faithfully beside the driver's door for 2 days, refusing to leave. The search eventually ended. Everyone else moved on. Rebecca couldn't. She lost her apartment, sold nearly everything she owned, and began living in Henry's old pickup with Buddy by her side. Then, just when hope seemed gone, a lawyer handed her an envelope. Henry had left her one final inheritance. An abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of Cedar Hollow. Most people called it worthless. Some even called it cursed. But Rebecca remembered something Henry had once told her while they drove past that lonely house years before. Forgotten places aren't always empty. Becca, sometimes they're simply waiting for someone who still believes they're worth saving. So she packed the few things she had left and drove toward the farmhouse. She believed she was going there to start over. She didn't know she was driving toward the secret Henry had died trying to protect. And before her first week in that old house was over, 3 quiet knocks in the middle of the night would change her life forever. By the time Rebecca reached the farmhouse, the afternoon sun was already sinking behind the rolling hills of Cedar Hollow. The house stood exactly as Henry had described it years before. Old, weathered, quiet. Its faded white paint had long surrendered to years of rain and wind, and the wide front porch leaned ever so slightly toward the fields, as though the house itself had grown tired of waiting. Most people would have seen a place that was falling apart. Rebecca saw something different. She saw the last place her grandfather had chosen for her. Buddy jumped from the truck before she had even turned off the engine. He paused at the bottom of the porch steps, sniffing the cool autumn air. Then, without hesitation, he climbed the steps and sat beside the front door, waiting. Rebecca smiled faintly. "You remember this place, don't you?" Buddy looked back at her but offered no answer. Some questions never needed words. The front door opened with surprising ease. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of old pine, dust, and the faint scent of a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains yellowed with age. Furniture remained exactly where someone had left it decades earlier. A rocking chair, a worn bookshelf, a small kitchen table. Nothing expensive, nothing remarkable. Yet every room carried the strange feeling that someone had intended to come back. Rebecca slowly walked from room to room. She ran her hand across the fireplace mantel. Photographs had once stood there. Only pale outlines remained. In the kitchen, she found an old coffee mug hanging from a hook. Its faded lettering read, "Home is where love waits." She couldn't explain why, but the words caught in her throat. Maybe because she hadn't felt at home anywhere for months. The afternoon passed quietly. Rebecca unpacked the few belongings she still owned. 2 suitcases, a family photo album, Henry's old pocket knife, a quilt her grandmother had sewn years before Rebecca was born. That was all. Funny how quickly a lifetime could fit into so few boxes. Outside, Buddy wandered the property. Unlike Rebecca, he seemed completely familiar with the land. He walked along the fence line, paused beside the old barn, sniffed around a massive oak tree near the edge of the field. More than once he stopped and glanced back toward the house, as if checking that Rebecca was still there. It reminded her of Henry. He had always done the same thing whenever they hiked together, never walking too far ahead, always looking back, always making sure she was safe. As evening settled over Cedar Hollow, the temperature dropped quickly. Rebecca gathered fallen branches and managed to light a small fire in the stone fireplace. Warm light slowly filled the living room. For the first time in months, she felt something she hadn't expected. Peace. Not happiness. Not yet, but peace. She heated a can of soup on the old stove while Buddy stretched out beside the fire. The farmhouse creaked now and then, settling into the cool night. Old houses always made sounds. Henry used to say every house had its own language. You just have to live there long enough to understand what it's trying to tell you. Rebecca smiled at the memory. She wished she could ask him what this house was saying. After dinner, she stepped onto the porch. The countryside was unlike anything she'd experienced in the city. No traffic, no sirens. Only the steady chorus of crickets and the whisper of wind moving through dry grass. Above her, thousands of stars filled the sky. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen so many. Buddy sat beside her, watching the darkness beyond the fields. His ears twitched once. Then again, Rebecca followed his gaze. Nothing. Just an old dirt road disappearing into the night. "You miss him too, don't you?" she whispered. Buddy rested his head against her leg. For a long moment neither of them moved. Sometimes silence is the closest thing we have to prayer. By 10 o'clock, exhaustion finally caught up with her. She locked the front door, checked the windows, and spread the old quilt across the bed upstairs. Buddy refused to leave the hallway. Instead, he lay down outside her bedroom door, exactly as he had done every night after Henry disappeared. Rebecca reached down and scratched behind his ears. "You don't have to guard me anymore." But he simply closed his eyes. Some promises even dogs refused to break. Sleep came quickly, but it didn't last. Rebecca woke suddenly, not because of a nightmare, because of a sound. Knock. Her eyes opened. The room was completely dark except for pale moonlight spilling through the curtains. She held her breath. Nothing. Only the ticking of an old clock somewhere downstairs. She almost convinced herself she had imagined it. Then Buddy stood. His nails clicked softly against the wooden floor. His ears pointed toward the front of the house. He wasn't barking. He wasn't growling. He was listening. Rebecca sat upright. "Buddy." The dog remained perfectly still. Then it came again. Knock. 3 slow taps. Measured. Patient. Not loud enough to frighten. Just loud enough to be impossible to ignore. Rebecca looked toward the bedside clock. 11:17 p.m. Her heart began to beat a little faster. Who would visit an abandoned farmhouse at that hour? There were no nearby neighbors. No lights across the fields. No passing cars. Only darkness. She slipped on her boots, pulled a sweater around her shoulders, and quietly walked downstairs. Buddy stayed one step ahead of her. Every light in the house remained off. The moon provided just enough silver light to outline the front door. Rebecca stopped a few feet away. Silence. She reached for the handle, then hesitated. Henry had taught her something years earlier. Never open a door because you're afraid. Open it because you've decided to know the truth. She took a slow breath, unlocked the deadbolt, turned the handle. The door swung open. Cold air drifted inside. The porch was empty. No footsteps. No vehicle. No shadow walking away. Only the endless field stretching beneath the moonlight. Rebecca stepped outside. "Hello." Her voice disappeared into the night. Buddy walked slowly across the porch, nose close to the wooden floor. He stopped near the top step, sniffed once, then lifted his head toward the old barn standing in the distance. His tail moved gently, not with excitement. Recognition. Rebecca followed his gaze. The barn stood silent beneath the stars. Yet, for the briefest moment, she could have sworn someone was standing beside it. She blinked. The figure was gone. The wind stirred through the grass once more. Rebecca wrapped her arms around herself. As she turned back toward the house, she noticed something she was certain hadn't been there before. Resting against the front door was a single weathered brass key. Rebecca stared at the brass key for several long seconds. It wasn't rusty. It wasn't covered in dirt. If anything, it looked as though someone had polished it only days before. She slowly bent down and picked it up. It felt heavier than she expected. A single letter had been engraved into the metal. Osh. Her breath caught. Henry. Buddy stepped closer, sniffed the key once, then looked toward the old barn again. His tail didn't wag. He simply waited. Rebecca slipped the key into her coat pocket. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "We'll see what you're trying to tell me." The wind answered with a quiet sigh across the fields. She barely slept the rest of the night. Every creak of the old farmhouse pulled her awake. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps crossing the porch. Yet no more knocking came. When morning finally arrived, soft golden light spilled across the valley. The farmhouse looked completely different, less mysterious, almost welcoming. Rebecca made coffee using an old enamel pot she had found in the kitchen. Buddy ate his breakfast quickly. Then, for the first time since they'd arrived, he walked to the front door and sat beside it, waiting. "You really want me to go out there, don't you?" Buddy stood immediately. That was answer enough. The barn stood about 60 yards from the house. Years of neglect had left its red paint faded almost gray. One door leaned crooked on broken hinges. The roof sagged in the middle. Rebecca understood why everyone in town had called the property worthless. Still, Henry had never been the kind of man who threw broken things away. He fixed them. Maybe that was why he had left this place to her. Buddy reached the barn first. Instead of going inside, he circled the building once, nose close to the ground. Then he stopped beside an old rain barrel. Hidden behind it was a narrow wooden door Rebecca hadn't noticed before. It looked almost invisible against the wall. She tried the handle. Locked. Rebecca reached into her pocket. The brass key. For a moment she simply stared at it. What are the odds? She slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, almost as if it had been waiting. The small room inside wasn't part of the barn at all. It was tucked between two walls, barely large enough for a desk and a chair. Dust covered everything, except one object, a green metal toolbox sitting neatly in the center of the floor. Rebecca recognized it immediately. Henry's toolbox, the one she thought she'd sold months earlier. She frowned. That wasn't possible. She remembered carrying it to the pawn shop herself. Unless Henry had owned another one. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside lay neatly arranged tools. A flashlight, a compass, a folded county map, and on top of everything, an envelope. Across the front, written in familiar handwriting, were 4 simple words. For Rebecca, if found, her eyes filled instantly. She carefully unfolded the letter. "Becca, if you're reading this, then Buddy trusted you enough to bring you here. Trust him. He has better instincts than most people I've known." Rebecca smiled through tears. That sounded exactly like Henry. She continued reading. "There are things about this farm I couldn't explain while you were growing up. Not because I didn't trust you. Because I wanted you to have a normal life for as long as possible." Her heartbeat quickened. Some people think evil always arrives looking dangerous. It doesn't. Sometimes it brings homemade pie. Sometimes it smiles across the church pew. Sometimes it's the first person to offer help after a storm. Rebecca lowered the letter. The words unsettled her. Henry wasn't writing about strangers. He was writing about someone they knew. Someone close. She unfolded the county map. Several locations had been marked in blue ink. The farmhouse, the river road, the abandoned grain elevator, and one place circled twice, Morrison Orchard. Rebecca frowned. The Morrison family had lived outside Cedar Hollow for decades. Henry used to buy apples there every fall. She remembered picnics beneath those trees when she was little. Why would he mark it? Buddy suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood straight. Someone was outside. Rebecca quietly switched off the flashlight. The room fell silent. She heard footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Not inside the barn. Outside it. Crunch. Crunch. Gravel. Buddy remained perfectly still. He didn't bark. That frightened Rebecca more than barking would have. But he barked at strangers. He stayed quiet when he was trying not to be noticed. The footsteps stopped. A man's voice drifted through the thin wooden wall. "Looks like somebody's been here." Another voice answered. "You sure?" "The front gate's open." Rebecca held her breath. She hadn't closed the gate after driving in yesterday. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. Now, it felt like a mistake. The second man laughed softly. Probably kids. Maybe. A long silence followed. Then came a sentence that made Rebecca's blood run cold. Still. Keep an eye on the house. The footsteps slowly faded. Neither Rebecca nor Buddy moved. 1 minute passed. Then another. Finally, Buddy relaxed. Rebecca let out the breath she'd been holding. Who were those men? They hadn't knocked. They hadn't called out. They had simply checked, as though visiting the property was part of a routine. Rebecca looked back at Henry's letter. One final paragraph remained. Her hands trembled as she read it. If anyone ever starts asking whether you've moved into the farmhouse, don't answer right away. Watch their eyes before you listen to their words. That's where the truth always hides. Rebecca folded the letter carefully. For the first time since arriving at the farmhouse, she understood something that changed everything. Henry hadn't left her a place to rebuild her life. He had left her a puzzle, and somewhere inside that puzzle was the reason he never came home. Rebecca remained inside the hidden room long after the footsteps outside had disappeared. The farmhouse had fallen silent again. Only the distant rustle of wind moving through the trees reached her ears. She looked down at the folded letter resting in her hands. Henry's handwriting. Steady, careful, comfortingly familiar. She read the final sentence once more. Watch their eyes before you listen to their words. Rebecca closed her eyes. Growing up, she had never understood how Henry always seemed to know when someone wasn't telling the truth. He never argued, never accused anyone. He simply watched. Sometimes, after meeting a stranger, he would quietly say, "People can control their words, Becca, but their eyes usually tell on them." Back then, she thought it was just another one of his old sayings. Now she realized those words had come from years of experience, years of seeing things most people overlooked. She carefully folded the letter and tucked it inside her jacket. Buddy sat patiently beside the doorway, watching her every move. "You've known about this place all along, haven't you?" The old shepherd looked at her with calm, amber eyes. Then he gently nudged her hand. Rebecca smiled. It wasn't a smile of happiness. Not yet. It was the first smile that had reached her face since Henry disappeared. For months, she had carried nothing but grief. Now, she was carrying purpose. When they returned to the farmhouse, Rebecca noticed things she hadn't seen the day before. Every picture hook on the wall was perfectly straight. Every kitchen drawer slid open without sticking. The firewood beside the fireplace had been stacked with careful precision. Henry had always believed that little things mattered. He used to tell her, "If someone takes care of the small things, you can usually trust them with the big ones." Rebecca slowly ran her hand across the old kitchen table. For 6 long months, she had lived with one painful thought, that Henry had left her behind. That, maybe, he had simply grown tired of fighting. The guilt settled heavily in her chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the quiet room. "I'm sorry I ever believed you gave up on me." The old farmhouse answered only with the soft creak of settling wood. But somehow, that silence felt kinder than before. That evening, Rebecca made a decision. She wasn't leaving. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Not until she understood why Henry had chosen this farmhouse. She searched through the kitchen until she found an old notebook tucked inside a drawer. On the first page she wrote, "Everything Grandpa wanted me to find." Below the title she carefully listed every clue. The brass key. The hidden room. Henry's letter. The marked locations on the county map. The 2 men outside the barn. Morrison Orchard. She stared at the list for several minutes. Until now. Each discovery had felt separate. Random. Now she could see they were connected. Henry hadn't hidden these things from her. He had arranged them. like pieces of a trail only she was meant to follow. As sunset painted the fields with shades of gold, Buddy suddenly stood. Without making a sound, he walked toward the giant oak tree near the edge of the property. Halfway there, he stopped, then looked back, waiting. Rebecca smiled softly. "All right, partner, I'm coming." Buddy scratched gently at the ground beneath the tree. Rebecca knelt beside him. She brushed away a layer of fallen leaves. The earth felt unusually loose. After digging only a few inches, her fingers touched wood. She carefully pulled a small weatherproof box from the soil. Her pulse quickened. Inside wasn't money, nor jewelry, just an old black and white photograph. Rebecca lifted it carefully. The picture showed two young deputies standing beside an old patrol car. One of them was Henry, much younger, smiling in a way she had rarely seen. Standing beside him was another man with one hand resting proudly on Henry's shoulder. Rebecca turned the photograph over. 5 words had been written neatly across the back. "Some friendships don't survive the truth." She frowned. The second man's face seemed strangely familiar. Older now, grayer, but unmistakable. Then it came to her. The annual harvest festival, town meetings, church dinners, the framed photographs hanging inside the Cedar Hollow diner. Hank Morrison. Rebecca felt the warmth leave her body. Hank wasn't just another farmer. He had been Henry's closest friend for more than 30 years. They had celebrated holidays together, shared fishing trips, watched 4th of July fireworks from the same hill. Henry had trusted him like family. Everything changed in that moment. Until now, Rebecca imagined danger as something distant, a stranger hiding in the woods, someone wearing a mask, someone easy to recognize. But Henry's words suddenly made perfect sense. Sometimes evil arrives with a smile. Sometimes it borrowed the face of someone everyone believed they could trust. Rebecca slipped the photograph into her notebook. For the first time, the mystery felt painfully personal. This wasn't just about a criminal operation. It was about betrayal. Night settled quietly over the valley. Rebecca carried 2 old rocking chairs onto the porch. She sat in one, Buddy stretched out beside her feet. Together, they watched the last light disappear beyond the fields. Henry loved sunsets. Whenever Rebecca complained that the day had gone badly, he would simply point toward the sky and say, "See that? Even the longest day knows how to end beautifully." She never appreciated those words as a teenager. Now, she wished she could hear him say them just one more time. Buddy rested his head gently against her knee. Rebecca stroked the gray fur around his ears. "You still believe he's with us?" Buddy slowly closed his eyes. For months, Rebecca had asked herself the same heartbreaking question. Why did Grandpa leave me? Tonight. That question finally changed. Now she asked, what was Grandpa trying so hard to protect? The difference was small, but it changed everything. One question was born from loss, the other from love, as darkness wrapped itself around the old farmhouse. Rebecca no longer felt like a frightened young woman searching for someone who had disappeared. She felt like the keeper of a promise. Henry had trusted her enough to leave behind a trail. Buddy had trusted her enough to lead her to it. Now, it was time for Rebecca to learn to trust herself, because somewhere beyond the next clue, the truth Henry had sacrificed everything to protect was finally beginning to reveal itself. The next morning arrived quietly. A thin layer of fog rested over the fields, softening the fences and the old barn until they looked like fading memories. Rebecca stood on the front porch with a mug of coffee warming her hands. Buddy sat beside her, watching the road in silence. For months, Every morning had begun with the same question. How am I going to survive today? Now another question had taken its place. What was Grandpa trying to show me? It was the first morning in a long time that fear wasn't the first thing she felt. Curiosity had taken its place. After breakfast, Rebecca spread everything she had found across the kitchen table. Henry's letter, the county map, the old photograph, the brass key, her notebook. Buddy lay beneath the table, occasionally lifting his head whenever she moved another piece of paper. She studied the map again. The farmhouse, the river road, the abandoned grain elevator, Morrison Orchard. At first, they seemed unrelated. Then she noticed something she had missed before. Each location sat almost perfectly along the same winding back road. A road hidden from the highway. A road large delivery trucks could travel without attracting attention. Rebecca reached for a pencil. She connected the marked locations with a single line. The route suddenly became obvious. Henry hadn't been marking random places. He had been tracing a pattern, a route. Her heart began to race. She remembered something else. Years ago, Henry had refused to drive that road after dark. Whenever she asked why, he would simply smile. Some roads are busier at night than they are during the day. She had always assumed he meant deer. Now, she wasn't so sure. But he suddenly stood. He walked to the back window overlooking the fields. His ears lifted. Rebecca joined him. Far, in the distance, a pickup truck rolled slowly along the gravel road before disappearing behind a line of trees. Nothing unusual. At least, that was what most people would have thought. But the truck never slowed near any house. It never stopped. It simply disappeared exactly where the road leading toward Morrison Orchard began. Rebecca made a note in her notebook. 10:18 a.m., dark pickup traveling toward Orchard. She stared at the words for a moment. Then she smiled. Henry had been right. Writing things down forced you to notice what others ignored. The rest of the afternoon passed in quiet work. Rebecca repaired a broken section of the porch railing. She cleaned years of leaves from the gutters. She stacked fresh firewood beside the back door. Anyone passing the farmhouse would see nothing unusual. Just a young woman trying to make an old home livable again. That was exactly what she wanted them to see, because while her hands repaired the house, her eyes were learning the land. She began noticing little things. A blue pickup that appeared twice but never stopped. Fresh tire tracks near the southern fence. A gate that seemed to open overnight and mysteriously close before sunrise. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, it felt like pieces of a conversation no one realized she had started listening to. Late that afternoon, an aging pickup pulled into the driveway. Rebecca's muscles tightened instinctively. Buddy stood but didn't bark. An elderly woman stepped out carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She smiled warmly. "You must be Henry's granddaughter." Rebecca nodded cautiously. "I am." The woman introduced herself as Evelyn Parker, who lived on the neighboring farm. "I used to bring your grandfather peach pie every Sunday," she said with a gentle laugh. "He always insisted my pie was better than his cooking." Rebecca smiled politely. For the first time since arriving, someone mentioned Henry with affection instead of pity. Evelyn looked around the farmhouse. "He loved this place. You knew him well." "About 40 years. The older woman hesitated. "Henry changed after your parents passed away. He became quieter. But kinder? He was always helping someone." Rebecca lowered her eyes. "Did he ever talk about why he came out here so often?" Evelyn's smile faded. "No, but I did notice something." "What?" "He stopped trusting people he used to call friends." Rebecca's heartbeat quickened. "Did he ever say who—" The woman slowly shook her head. He never mentioned names. He only told me something I'll never forget. She looked directly into Rebecca's eyes. If anything ever happens to me, tell Becca to trust Buddy before she trusts anyone else. Rebecca felt tears sting her eyes. Even years ago, Henry had been thinking about protecting her. After Evelyn left, Rebecca stood alone on the porch for a long time. Buddy rested against her leg. She looked down at him. I guess Grandpa believed in you more than he believed in people. Buddy wagged his tail once, slowly, almost thoughtfully. Rebecca laughed. I think he was right. That evening, she opened Henry's notebook again. This time, she didn't read it as a grieving granddaughter. She read it as someone continuing another person's work. She copied every location from the map into her own notebook. She created columns, dates, times, vehicles, weather, anything she observed. It felt strangely familiar, like she had done it before. Then she remembered. As a little girl, Henry used to let her help him fill out wildlife journals after their camping trips. He'd smile every time she noticed something he missed. I always knew you'd make a good investigator, he'd say. Back then, she thought he was joking. Maybe. He never was. Night settled gently across the valley. Rebecca extinguished every light except the small lamp in the kitchen. From outside, the farmhouse looked almost abandoned. She stood quietly at the window, watching, waiting, learning patience. Buddy joined her. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. Nearly an hour passed. Then, headlights appeared in the distance. One truck, then another, both traveling slowly along the same back road marked on Henry's map. Neither vehicle had its headlights on full beam. Both disappeared behind the trees leading toward Morrison Orchard. Rebecca immediately wrote down the time. 11:42 p.m. A few minutes later, another truck followed. Then another. She looked down at Henry's map, at the line connecting every marked location, at her own notes beside it. For the first time, she wasn't guessing anymore. She was seeing exactly what Henry had seen. The farmhouse had never been meant to hide her from the world. It had been built to watch it. Rebecca closed her notebook and looked out across the dark fields. They have no idea someone's paying attention, she whispered. Buddy remained perfectly still beside her, as though he had been waiting months to hear those words. And somewhere beyond the trees, engines rumbled quietly through the night, unaware that Henry Foster's watch had not ended. It had simply found a new keeper. The following morning, Rebecca woke before sunrise. For the first time in months, she didn't wake with that familiar weight pressing against her chest. The grief was still there. She knew it always would be, but it no longer felt like an anchor. It felt like a promise. Buddy was already waiting by the front door. The moment she picked up her notebook, he stood and wagged his tail once, not excited, expectant, almost as though he understood they had work to do. Rebecca smiled. Looks like we're partners now. Over the next several days, life settled into an unusual rhythm. To anyone driving past the farmhouse, Rebecca appeared to be nothing more than a young woman trying to restore an old family property. She painted the porch railing, repaired broken fence posts, planted vegetables in the neglected garden behind the house. She waved politely whenever a passing truck slowed near the gate. She never acted suspicious. That was exactly how Henry would have wanted it. But every evening, after the last light faded from the valley, her routine quietly changed. She carried Henry's notebook to the kitchen table, compared her observations with his, added new times, new vehicles, new patterns. The more she watched, the more she realized Henry hadn't been following random events. He had been documenting a system, The trucks always traveled on the same nights, always took the same back roads, always disappeared before sunrise. There was nothing accidental about it. Rebecca found herself thinking about Henry differently now. As a child, she had believed her grandfather was simply a hard-working man who loved fixing broken things. Now she understood he had spent years fixing something much larger. His community, without applause, without recognition, without expecting anyone to know. She looked at the faded photograph of Henry in his sheriff's uniform. "I never really knew everything about you, did I?" Buddy rested his head against her knee. Neither of them needed an answer. One afternoon, Rebecca drove into Cedar Hollow to buy paint and groceries. The town looked exactly as she remembered. The old diner, the feed store, the white church at the end of Main Street. People greeted one another by name. Children rode bicycles without anyone worrying. It looked like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. Maybe that was why Henry had stayed. Some places were worth protecting, even when they didn't realize they needed protecting. As she carried her groceries back to the truck, someone called her name. Rebecca. She turned. Hank Morrison was walking toward her. He smiled warmly. The same smile she remembered from childhood. The same smile in the old photograph. "Your grandfather would have been happy to know you're fixing up that old place." Rebecca returned a polite smile. "I hope so." Hank adjusted his hat. "If you ever need help around the farm, just let me know." His words sounded kind, but Henry's letter echoed quietly in her mind. "Watch their eyes before you listen to their words." Rebecca looked carefully. Hank was smiling. His eyes weren't. They kept drifting toward the back of her truck, toward Buddy, toward the toolbox lying beneath a blanket. He wasn't making conversation. He was looking for information. For just a second, Rebecca saw something she had never noticed before. Not anger, not fear. Calculation. It disappeared almost instantly. "Well," Hank said cheerfully, "good seeing you again." "You too." She watched him walk away. Only after he disappeared into the hardware store did Rebecca realize she had been holding her breath. On the drive home, she said very little. Buddy sat quietly beside her. Finally, she spoke. Grandpa was right. She reached over and scratched behind Buddy's ears. I almost believed him. The old dog leaned gently into her hand, as though reminding her that trusting carefully wasn't the same as becoming bitter. That evening, Rebecca returned to the hidden room inside the barn. She spread Henry's papers across the small desk. There were still dozens of pages she hadn't read. One notebook caught her attention. Its cover was worn almost smooth. Inside were entries spanning several years. Most described ordinary things. Weather, harvest seasons, repairs around town. But gradually the notes changed. Henry began recording unfamiliar license plate numbers, late-night engine sounds, strange lights moving near the river. Then one sentence stopped Rebecca cold. "If anything happens to me, I hope Becca remembers that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to protect someone even while you're afraid." Rebecca closed the notebook. Those words reached deeper than anything else Henry had written. For months, she had believed courage belonged to other people. Police officers, soldiers, heroes in movies. Henry had spent years quietly showing her something different. Courage looked like getting up before dawn to earn an honest living. It looked like raising a granddaughter after burying your own son. It looked like choosing kindness after heartbreak. And sometimes, it looked like staying when leaving would have been easier. A sudden sound interrupted her thoughts. Buddy's ears lifted. A truck engine. Closer than before. Rebecca quietly extinguished the lantern. The hidden room fell into darkness. She moved toward the narrow window overlooking the field. A single pickup rolled slowly along the fence line. It stopped for only a few seconds, long enough for someone inside to study the farmhouse. Then it drove away without a sound. Rebecca waited several more minutes before speaking. "They're checking to see if I'm still here." Buddy gave a quiet huff. "Not frightened. Ready?" That night, Rebecca made one final decision. She carried Henry's old sheriff's badge from the toolbox and placed it inside the top drawer of the kitchen table. Not because she intended to wear it, because she wanted to remember what it represented. Service, responsibility, integrity. She opened her notebook and turned to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, "Continue Grandpa's work." Below it, she listed 3 simple promises. Stay patient. Tell the truth. Protect innocent people. She stared at the words for a long moment. Then she signed her name beneath them, not as a child searching for the grandfather she had lost, but as a woman accepting the responsibility he had quietly prepared her for all along. Outside, the wind swept gently across the fields. The farmhouse no longer felt like a place haunted by unanswered questions. It felt like a watchtower, a place where one faithful man had stood guard for years. Now, another pair of eyes watched from those same windows. And somewhere beyond the darkness, the people Henry had spent so long observing had no idea that Rebecca Foster was no longer simply following his trail. She was beginning to think exactly the way he did. 3 nights later, the valley was wrapped in silence once again. Rebecca sat beside the darkened kitchen window with Henry's notebook resting open in front of her. Buddy lay quietly at her feet. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Waiting had become part of who they were. Henry had once written in the margin of one of his notebooks, "The hardest part of protecting people isn't courage. It's patience." Rebecca understood that now. Some truths refused to be rushed. At exactly 11:41 p.m., headlights appeared beyond the tree line. One truck, then another, just as they had every Tuesday and Friday night. She wrote down the time, the direction, the number of vehicles. A few minutes later, another pair of headlights joined them. Everything matched Henry's notes almost perfectly. The pattern hadn't changed. Only the person watching it had. Rebecca closed the notebook. There was enough. Henry had spent years collecting evidence. She had spent days confirming it. Together, their work told a story no rumor ever could. The next morning, Rebecca drove nearly 40 miles to the county sheriff's office in Ashford instead of Cedar Hollow. Henry had never written why, but she trusted his judgment. The sheriff on duty was a silver-haired man named Daniel Brooks. He listened quietly as Rebecca placed Henry's notebooks, photographs, maps, and her own observations across his desk. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush her. When she finished, he sat silently for nearly a minute, carefully turning the worn pages. Finally, he looked up. "Your grandfather documented this for years." Rebecca nodded. "He believed nobody would listen until there was enough proof." The sheriff closed the final notebook. "I think he was right." Within hours, investigators began comparing Henry's notes with reports from neighboring counties. The same vehicles had appeared elsewhere. The same roads. The same nights. Separate pieces suddenly formed a single picture. What had seemed like isolated incidents was actually an organized smuggling operation stretching across several counties. Henry hadn't imagined any of it. He had simply been the first person patient enough to see the whole pattern. Rebecca returned to the farmhouse before sunset. The waiting began again. This time she wasn't alone. Unmarked vehicles quietly positioned themselves along distant back roads. Deputies waited where the old river crossing narrowed. Others remained hidden near the abandoned grain elevator. No flashing lights, no sirens, Only silence. Henry would have appreciated that. Just before midnight, the first truck appeared. It rolled slowly along the familiar route, exactly as it always had. A second truck followed, then a third. They never reached the river. Red and blue lights suddenly burst across the darkness. Voices echoed through the valley. Engines stopped. Doors opened. Within minutes, the quiet road that had hidden so many secrets became brighter than Rebecca had ever seen it. She stood on the porch, unable to look away. Buddy sat beside her. Neither of them celebrated. They simply watched. Because some victories arrived quietly, the arrests continued through the early morning hours. Several suspects were taken into custody. Boxes of illegal cargo were recovered. Documents connected years of unexplained activity throughout the region. When investigators searched properties connected to the operation, they discovered records Henry had never lived long enough to find. His work had opened the first door. Others had finished opening the rest. Just after sunrise, Sheriff Brooks walked slowly up the farmhouse steps. He removed his hat before speaking. "Rebecca." She looked at him. "We've confirmed almost everything your grandfather wrote." She swallowed hard. "And Henry." The sheriff hesitated. "We found evidence that he confronted the wrong people." His voice softened. "We still don't know every detail about what happened to him." Rebecca lowered her eyes. For a brief moment, the old pain returned. Not as sharp as before, but still there. The sheriff gently handed her a small envelope. "We did find this." It was hidden inside one of the storage sheds connected to the investigation. Across the front, written in Henry's familiar handwriting, were 3 words. "For my Becca." Rebecca carefully unfolded the letter. "My dear Becca, if this letter ever reaches you, it means something happened before I could explain everything myself. I'm sorry for that. More than you'll ever know. You may spend years wondering whether I was afraid. The truth is, I was. Every single day. Fear isn't what changes a person's life. The decision they make while they're afraid does. If you're reading this, then you already made the same choice I did. You chose to care. Don't ever regret that." Rebecca stopped reading. Tears blurred the page. Buddy quietly rested his head against her hand. She smiled through the tears and continued. "You once asked me what the bravest thing I ever did was. It wasn't wearing a badge. It wasn't standing up to dangerous men. It was raising a little girl who taught an old man how to believe in tomorrow again. You saved me long before I ever protected you. Never forget that. Love always leaves the world better than it found it. Grandpa." Rebecca folded the letter carefully. She held it against her heart. For months, she had believed she had lost the last person who truly loved her. Now, she understood something entirely different. Love hadn't disappeared with Henry. It had simply changed hands. It had become hers to carry forward. Weeks passed. Life slowly returned to Cedar Hollow. The old farmhouse no longer stood empty. Fresh paint covered the porch. Flowers bloomed beneath the front windows. Children from nearby farms often stopped to pet Buddy through the fence. Rebecca never turned them away. One Saturday morning, she placed a small wooden sign beside the driveway. "The Foster Farm, everyone welcome." She repaired the old barn, turned a part of it into a shelter for abandoned dogs. The first animal she rescued was an elderly hound no one wanted anymore. Buddy walked over, sniffed the newcomer gently, then lay down beside him without hesitation. Rebecca laughed softly. Grandpa would have liked that. The wind carried the sound across the fields. For just a moment, it almost felt as though someone had laughed with her. Every evening, before the sun disappeared beyond the hills, Rebecca carried 2 bowls onto the porch. One for Buddy, One she left empty for a few quiet moments, not because she expected Henry to come walking down the road, but because some traditions aren't about waiting for the past, they're about remembering the people who taught us how to keep moving forward. Then, with a grateful smile, she picked up the empty bowl, looked across the peaceful valley Henry had loved so deeply, and whispered the words she no longer spoke with sadness. "Thank you, Grandpa." This time, it felt like goodbye, and somehow, it also felt like home. Some stories don't end when a person is gone. Sometimes, that's where they truly begin. Rebecca once believed Henry Foster had left her behind. Now she understood something different. He had never left. He had simply spent the last chapter of his life making sure she would never have to face hers alone. The farmhouse wasn't the greatest gift he left behind. Neither were the letters, nor the evidence that finally brought justice to Cedar Hollow. His greatest gift was showing Rebecca what real courage looks like. Not loud, not perfect, just an ordinary person choosing to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. And one day, Rebecca realized she had become exactly the kind of person Henry had always believed she could be. Months later, life at the farmhouse felt peaceful again. The fences had been repaired. Flowers bloomed beneath the porch. Buddy, now slower with age, spent most afternoons sleeping in the warm sunlight. Every evening, just before sunset, Rebecca carried 2 bowls onto the porch. One for Buddy. The other she placed beside it for only a few quiet moments. Then she smiled, picked it up, and whispered, "He's home now, old boy." Buddy looked toward the distant fields one last time, then lowered his head and quietly began to eat. For the first time, he didn't wait. Rebecca looked across the valley Henry had loved so deeply. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. The old rocking chair beside her remained empty. Yet somehow, she no longer felt alone, because the people who teach us how to love never truly leave us. They remain in every kind choice we make, every promise we keep, every life we make a little brighter than we found it. Perhaps that is the greatest inheritance anyone can leave behind. Not money,